All right, greetings everyone. I want to welcome you to Capital Community College's series through the Hartford Heritage Project, supported by Connecticut Humanities, our series on Hartford history that we're in our third season now. And this is our fifth event and our last lecture of this season. I'm grateful to everybody who's participated and everybody who has come online to listen to these and also to see the recordings and listen to the recordings, which are all available at the Hartford Heritage website. I will be putting that into the chat later on so everybody can see how to access it. I will also be putting some information up about ways to contribute to the college. We do really great work in Hartford, and we hope that people will support student scholarships and so forth. We have our big annual gala this Friday. I'll put information up about that. I also want to give a shout out to Bill Hosley, who's been putting this whole series together and has been one of the speakers in the event in the series as well. And Bill is recovering from surgery on his knee, so we just wish him well. And he's with us tonight, and we'll probably chime in later when we get to the Q&A time. And in terms of Q&A, there will be an opportunity at the end for you to raise your hand, and I will give open your microphone so you'll be able to ask Tracey Wilson your questions. And for now, I'd like to get straight to the event. I'd like to begin by introducing Dr. Tracey Wilson, who is a retired West Hartford Public Schools history teacher. She earned her BA and MA right in Hartford at Trinity College and did a PhD in history at Brown University. Her master's thesis was about Connecticut women's suffrage movement, which is the topic of tonight's lecture. And in her dissertation, she wrote a comparative study of working women at Colt's Firearms and Travelers Insurance Company in the first half of the 20th century. Her current public history project, you might have heard of it, it's called Witness Stones West Hartford. She and her partners are researching on enslaved people in West Hartford and conducting professional development with 8th grade public school teachers and having students learn and write the stories, and then installing stones to commemorate those lost to history. This opens the door to our witness of the history of slavery on which the town was founded. She serves as West Hartford's town historian. So I want to welcome everyone and thank you, Dr. Wilson, for being here tonight. And I want to again acknowledge for this entire series Connecticut Humanities, who has brought this, that made this all possible. So thank you, and I will hand it over now to Tracey.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I'm so excited to be here tonight, and I want to thank you for all your help getting this set up and with a little technology stuff before we got started, and to Mike also, who helped me get my screen set up. Thank you to Bill Hosley for asking me to do this, and of course to the Connecticut Humanities Council for funding this. With but 2 weeks left to the election, I hope this talk about voting will reinforce your will to exercise the franchise as you learn how the suffragists saw their role in this democracy as, yes, being about voting and also going far beyond voting. I'm just going to share my screen with you now. Hang on a second. Get my first slide up here. The ideas of civic engagement of these women were wide-ranging, and I would venture to guess fits many of you in the audience today. Women in Connecticut spent over 50 years advocating for voting rights and the ability to serve as an elected official. In 1920, after women got the right to vote, 24 women ran for the State House and 5 won. And on this opening page here, you see Mariah Stewart, who you'll learn more about. This is Edna Purtell here. And this is Edna down here with her brother, who was a senator, and her sister, Eileen. And I noticed that Matt, her great grandnephew, is one of our participants today. He just sent me this picture, and later we're going to actually hear her voice. And Matt allowed me to borrow a tape from him that has an interview of her. So this will be the first time I've ever tried that. This woman here, let's see if I can get my pointer going. So, is Katharine Houghton Hepburn, the mother of the actress Katharine Hepburn. She was head of the Women's Suffrage Association starting in 1910. And here you'll see Emily Pearson, who was a state organizer who was recognized around the country for her direct action work. And in the bottom right corner here, you see a woman named Edith Beach. And Edith Beach looks like a modern woman here, the first woman in West Hartford to drive a car, but she was an anti-suffragist. And so her story is important as well. And I just want to, I like to talk about through lines. Today, Hartford's delegation to the State House includes only one woman, Minnie Gonzalez, out of 9. There are 2 senators and 7 representatives. I wonder, how does this happen when 4% more women vote than men? For the first time ever, West Hartford's delegation of 1 senator and 3 representatives will include 3 female representatives after the election in a couple of weeks. Certainly, women have always been discerning voters, and women do not just automatically support other women, but hopefully there is a push in Hartford. If you can see below, there are a number of women who are serving on the City Council and the Board of Ed who maybe are preparing to join those at the State House. I want to start tonight by talking about the opposition to women's suffrage. This is a key part of the story, and one that has through lines to today as we see anti-woman propaganda being used against women, like Representative Jillian Gilchrist, who's running for state rep from West Hartford this fall. The present national administration has appointed a cabinet of 24 people, 4 of whom are women, the fewest number of women since 1980. Women need to continue to be civically active to retain the gains they have made. So it was just 100 years ago on September 14th that Connecticut passed the 19th Amendment. Finally, Governor Marcus Holcomb was willing to call a special session to vote on the 19th Amendment. Tennessee was the 36th state to ratify, but it was not totally clear that that vote was legal. Connecticut also had to develop legislation that would allow for women to register for the election just 6 weeks away. Women would have gotten the right to vote in Connecticut even if Connecticut's General Assembly did not ratify the 19th Amendment on September 21st, 1920. So in many ways, people might say that Connecticut's struggle for women's suffrage was a failure. We were the 37th state to ratify. But the state story has many successes as well. There was very strong opposition to women's suffrage here, though Connecticut was controlled by Republicans, and in fact, in 1920, Republicans got most of women's votes, and Republicans mostly supported the amendment. The Republican leadership in Connecticut did not. There was a fear on the part of men that the 200,000 women in Connecticut would change the balance of power here. They feared women voters would close down saloons and brothels, prohibit exploitative labor practices, and support temperance. So who were these men that women tried to convince that voting was a right for all adults? Well, J. Henry Rohrabaugh was one of the big reasons that suffrage did not pass in Connecticut. He was the head of the Republican Party from the northwestern corner of the state. Rohrabaugh headed the party for 25 years, and he was a fiscal and social conservative. He was joined by Republican Senators Brandegee and McLean, and who voted against the suffrage amendment in the U.S. Senate. They argued that voting was a states' rights issue. Brandegie, the most conservative, said women should not be worried about suffrage. They, quote, had better go home and knit bandages and pick lint for the war effort during World War I. McLean, also a Republican, opposed suffrage. Nationally, things really heated up in 1919 when the House of Representatives passed the suffrage amendment, and 2 weeks later, on June 4th, the Senate passed the amendment by a vote of 56 to 25. The split of the votes was interesting. 36 Republicans, yes, 20 Democrats, no. Of the 8 Republicans who voted no, they included Brandegie and McLean. 17 Democrats voted no. They sent it to the states for 3/4 of those states, 36 to ratify it. So Governor Marcus Holcomb was governor from 1915 to 21. He vehemently opposed suffrage. 1919, he was 75 years old, came of age during the Civil War, and is most known as being a war governor. Holcomb refused to call the General Assembly into session in the summer of 1920 because he did not see women's suffrage as, quote unquote, an emergency, the only reason to call a special session. J. Henry Rohrabaugh ran the Republican State Committee, and he and Holcomb would not be moved. This political cartoon shows men out of touch with suffrage, the suffrage issue, Rohrabaugh looking through the wrong end of the telescope, and his elected officials hiding and listening to his every word. And look at the power of the woman's vote coming in from the West. In this cartoon, Holcomb is really digging in his heels on suffrage, being depicted as the modern King Canute. The cartoon mocks him, showing the futility of trying to stop the tide. All the while, Canute believes he has the power to do so, aided by his Republican henchmen. And it wasn't just men who opposed suffrage, women did as well. The Connecticut Association opposed to women's suffrage formed in 1911. This is a letter from the Hartford Courant from 1917 from Hartford's Grace Markham, who was the first president of this organization. And she, in this letter, spells out the positions that you see here to enforce the differences between men and women and preserve the home, to encourage participation in community events, but not through partisan politics. Edith Beach, and you can see these were the headquarters in Hartford. So Edith Beach, who is this West Hartford woman I was talking to you about before, was a director of the organization. You can see this, you may be able to see it if your screen's big enough. She sat on stage in 1913 as Lucy Price, an anti-suffragist from Ohio, gave an address at the West Hartford Town Hall, and Beach sat on the stage with Addie Arnold and Mrs. H.E. Robbins from West Hartford. 21 Hartford women in the article on the left attended this first annual anti-meeting. Edith Beach was the first West Hartford woman to own and drive a car, and she, like Markham suggested, was very involved in municipal and national affairs. This is her house on South Main Street, now Brightwood Lane. She sat on the Red Cross Bureau for West Hartford to support the war effort for World War I. Here you can see the work that Edith and her sister Mary did to raise money in 1918 for the war effort. They sponsored a French market, which attracted 1,200 people and raised the equivalent of about $1 million today in war bonds. The Beach sisters were really engaged in the town. And this is a little bit of a footnote, this next slide, but I think important to think about. And that is that I just recently realized that this suffrage struggle was going on during a pandemic. So a battle for suffrage, World War I being fought, and the Spanish flu epidemic. This article decried the Public Health Office in Hartford, reported that the Hartford Golf Club would be used as a temporary hospital for those who contracted the flu. And a week later, the Beaches had this event, which attracted 1,200 people, adding a new twist to this civic engagement. In Connecticut, 8,500 people died of the Spanish flu. I think right now we have about 4,500 dead in Connecticut. And it was 8,500 out of 180,000 cases. We have about 4,500 dead out of about 54,000 cases. And I thought that mask, I think, would make it today. So who did support suffrage for women, and how did they advocate for the right for women all over the state? Some argue that suffrage started with this woman, Maria Stuart, born in Hartford in 1803, who gave a speech in 1832 in Boston in which she called for women to be involved in the political life. Most people pinpoint the start of the movement in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention, but Black women who spoke publicly were more than 15 years ahead of them. And I commend this recently published book to you by Professor Martha Jones, who writes about public political advocacy by Black women. She argues that Black women in their work for suffrage, in fact, were defining what it meant to be American. She writes about Hartford Stewart, who defined the issues 190 years ago. As a political movement, the 20th century campaign in Connecticut really heated up in 1910 with a generational change in leadership. At that time, the story in the country was pretty messy. Full suffrage in the West, partial suffrage in some states, and no suffrage in 15 states in 1914. In Connecticut, women could vote on education and library issues. And as you listen to Edna Purtell a little bit later, she talks about her mother voting on education and library issues. This map shows us something that activists like to see, inequity. And this is what encourages the movement. There's not equal access. If you move from one state to another, you could gain or lose a right. The Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association, the organization that pushed for the state-by-state approach to winning suffrage, hired Emily Pearson in 1910 to organize to convince local legislators to vote for suffrage. She used new strategies in this movement to win the right to vote. She heard Emmeline Pankhurst from England speak in Hartford at the Parsons Theater at 1087 Main Street in 1909. Parsons Theater was just north of G. Fox, today Capital Community College, to just across the highway on Main Street towards the Yard Goat Stadium. At the theater, Pankhurst wanted to bring the suffrage debate to the minds of those who would vote on it. When the suffragettes in England could not get a meeting with the Prime Minister in 1909, the 3,000 police prevented the women from entering Parliament and arrested 108 of them. The police were violent, and the women shifted their strategy and they began breaking windows to get their attention. It is after this event in October 1909 that Pankhurst comes to Hartford to speak. Pankhurst comes to tell her story, and Pearson goes to hear it. Pearson takes on direct action techniques after this. Up till 1910, it had all been about education and gentle persuasion of the legislators. She organized numerous auto tours in public places. At that point, it was novel for women to drive, novel to have a public platform to speak from. She organized parades, which put women in the public sphere. And this is on Main Street in Hartford. You can see here, 85% of teachers in the US are women. This next one, this is another one from Main Street. This one I'm most interested in. You can see, those of you who know Hartford, Sage Allen, but look at the crowd here. It looks like it's 7 or 8 people deep. And so this is a big deal for women to be out in public parading down the street. And as you can see from the crowd, there was much interest in this. Unlike in some other states, Pearson early on made alliances with working women and men and helped to send this deputation to Washington to meet with President Wilson in 1916. Her co-organizer translated her speeches into Italian, French, and German, and took the information to the factories in Hartford. Pearson was extremely successful in her work. This deputation included 32 participants from 21 towns and represented 19 different trades and occupations. In 1910, there were 300 members of the Suffrage Association in 3 cities. By 1917, there were 38,000 members with 100 local organizations. So what led to the change in tactics and the increased involvement of women in advocating for the vote? My amateurist chart here shows us a changing economy, tripling of the number of women in wage work. I think I've got, you can see here from 48,000 to 146,000, a move out of domestic service. So over a third of people women in 1880 were involved in domestic service. And by 1920, that was cut in half. And an increase in the number of women in clerical work, a more independent type of job. And you can see that here. And a big international event. There's a big question among women how to react to the World War. Should they remain anti-war? Should we stay out of the war effort because of the lack of government support for suffrage? Most women joined the war effort hoping it would lead to recognition of their rights to full citizenship. And you can see here, now is the time to show the boys over there that we are solidly behind them. And so it was a thought of many women that if we supported the war effort, suffrage would follow. So I just realized I called Mary Townsend Seymour Mariah Stewart. I was thinking, we don't have a photograph of Mariah Stewart from the 1830s. So actually, this is Mary Townsend Seymour. I'm sorry about that. Mary Townsend Seymour and Josephine Bennett are 2 women who developed leadership skills in this movement. Mary Townsend Seymour embodies the values of the women who were involved in the suffrage movement in Connecticut. Seymour was an African-American woman advocating for suffrage and more. She also was one of the founders of the Hartford chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She was a true progressive reformer of her era, working on issues that included school segregation, lynching, separate public accommodations for Blacks, immigration, the Red Cross during World War I, radical politics, and union organizing for tobacco workers. The world she operated in could not have been easy. Blacks made up less than 2% of the 100,000 people who lived in the city. Here is the opening line of a Hartford Courant article describing, quote unquote, the aristocracy of colored people in the city, including a messenger, a servant, a pastor, a Senate messenger, and a janitor of Hartford Public High School. The article said, quote, colored people in Hartford in the days of yore seem to have played well their part as factotums to the first families and in contributing to the comfort and convenience of the white folks generally, praised as sober, happy, and useful, unquote. If this was the height of Black society in Hartford from a white perspective, how must they have looked at Mary Townsend Seymour founding the NAACP? One avenue Seymour found power in dealing directly with influential white women reformers, was through allying with white women, including a woman named Josephine Bennett. Now, Josephine Bennett lived her life as an equal, marching in suffrage parades and organizing meetings. Seymour joined with Bennett to organize women working and processing tobacco during the war years in 1918. In Seymour's visits with African-American families through the Civilian Relief Home Service section of the Red Cross, she found some women making as little as $4 per week. And Bennett was very involved in the suffrage movement, both in the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Party. Seymour actually got a job in a tobacco factory, stripping leaves to understand working conditions. Together, she and Bennett helped organize a group of tobacco workers after they had met at a meeting of the NAACP in 1918. They got the Hartford Central Labor Union and the International Ladies Garment Workers Union to support them. 61 women joined, if only for a short time. Seymour served as secretary of the local with its headquarters at 420 New Britain Avenue, her home, still standing, now a nail supply place, not too far from Trinity College. Superintendent of the Hartford Public Schools at this time, Thomas Weaver, provoked Seymour in 1917 when he floated the idea that the Hartford Public Schools should be segregated with a separate night school for Blacks. He said that white students were making Blacks the butt of their jokes, and having segregated classes would stop that. Part of the issue was the Great Migration, with Southern Blacks making their way to the city during World War I, a group of people who didn't quite know the, quote, rules of the North. Know that at this time, again, Blacks made up only about 2% of Hartford's population. Seymour thought a chapter of the NAACP in Hartford could help. She called W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary White Ovington, and James Weldon Johnson, the author, lawyer, and songwriter. These three were key leaders in the organization, which used legal means to press for equality. And they came to Hartford. They actually came to her house on New Britain Avenue. The pressure from this local NAACP and others forced Weaver to drop his plan for the segregated high school. Seymour understood power and had the ability to bring important stakeholders together. Seymour lent her voice to the suffrage movement as well, and when women won the right to vote in 1920, she was able to vote. And in 1920, she ran for the Board of Education in Hartford and then for state representative for the General Assembly under the Farm Labor Party. She did not win, but ran a campaign. There is some misconception about the right of Black people to vote. In the national suffrage story, racism in the organization and a fear that allowing Black women to vote in the South would challenge the white supremacy of Southern Democrats. Blacks in the South, for all intents and purposes, had been disenfranchised by the poll tax, the grandfather clause, and literacy tests. And if we remember back to our map, none of the Southern states allowed full suffrage for women. Blacks could vote in the North, and suffrage here meant suffrage for Blacks as well. I don't have great data here, but I did find this chart that showed the percentage of Black men voting in 1920. You can see that more than 50% of Black men voted, and about 66% of white men voted in that election. This is not at all to say that Blacks were treated equally here or that there was not discrimination, but it's not fair to say that Black people were not allowed to vote. Seymour was not alone. In 1918, the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association reached out to African Americans to meet 500 African Americans in New Haven for a meeting and voted to form a colored suffrage league to fight for full political rights. Seymour was involved in many issues. Here you see her letter to the editor published in the Hartford Courant, encouraging the newspaper to, like the New York World newspaper, not use derogatory terms in referring to the Black troops in France. The Courant agrees not to use the term, quote unquote, darky, but in so doing, say that Seymour is being too sensitive. Seymour, though not a state leader in the suffrage movement, was a foot soldier and followed the politics of the movement. In 1917, the leader of the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association that you see here, Catherine Houghton Hepburn, and board member Josephine Bennett resigned from their leadership in the CWSA and turned to the National Woman's Party. Connecticut's affiliate to the National Woman's Party broke off from the CWSA in 1917 when many of the leaders wanted more direct action, like Emily Pearson had been advocating since 1910. Bennett also moved to the National Women's Party, as did Seymour. Hepburn and Pearson were incredible leaders of the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association, so Hepburn's letter to switch to the Connecticut Women's Party meant something. she says, we have gone to war for democracy, and yet millions of women in our country are denied the right to vote. Simply mentioning this fact in suffrage journals and to suffrage audiences is futile. We must say it in such a way that all the world will hear, and that is what the pickets of the Women's Party have done at Washington. My sympathies are all with them. I admire their honesty, their self-forgetfulness, and their practical wisdom. In my opinion, it is through such women as these that we shall secure the suffrage in Connecticut by federal amendment. In the future, I shall support the Women's Party. So Edna Purtell, another, a Hartford woman at this point, she moves to West Hartford in, I think, 1937, wanted to do more direct action for her right to vote through the work of the Women's Party. She was a working class woman involved in many issues as well as suffrage. She learned to wield power through her deeds, her principled approach, and her deep sense of values tied to equality. Purtell was the daughter of a cigar maker and a cigar stripper. Her father was a member of Samuel Gompers' Cigar Makers Union, and in her interview, she talks about meeting Samuel Gompers when she was a little girl. In 1911, he advocated to allow a black man into the union because he knew that blacks, just like whites, paid the same 5 cents for a loaf of bread. And she says, Edna says that her father also worked to get a black man in the union. It wasn't successful, but he knew that African Americans would be used against the union, and so he wanted to include black people in the union. Purtell's mother was a cigar stripper who belonged to the union as well. Perhaps their paths crossed with Mary Seymour and Josephine Bennett. Edna graduated from Hartford's Knight High School in 1917. She held jobs as a babysitter, a clerk at the 5 and 10, and as a tobacco stripper. At 16, she was elected secretary of the Cigar Strippers Union. By age 18, she went to work at the Travelers Insurance Company in the filing department. In 1918, at age 19, Purtell volunteered in the women's suffrage movement, handing out leaflets in downtown Hartford at lunchtime and going door to door to get signatures. And again, I want to thank Matt for allowing me to digitize this tape. And I'm going to ask you, or I'm going to offer you the opportunity to listen to her, which I think is really cool. This tape was done 40 years ago in 1980 when she was 81 years old. It was done by a woman named Carol Nichols, who also wrote about the Connecticut women's suffrage movement. And I'm just going to go to the next. I'm going to just show you 2 pictures of her. And so while I'm playing this, you can just close your eyes or you can look at the screen, whatever, and imagine her talking. And the section is about 10 minutes in length. And so I hope you'll just sort of settle in and listen. Okay, and I hope, Jeff, you'll tell me that it's working. Okay, I gotta take these out.
Yeah, I'll let you know.
Okay.
Edna M. Purtell at her home in West Hartford, Connecticut on Wednesday, June 18, 1980.
Okay, I'm just going to skip it here.
Interesting. Well, let's talk about your interest in the suffrage movement. When did you get interested in the suffrage movement?
Well, my mother used to vote on the school question when I was a kid. She used to say, because and I must have heard it, taken note of it, that they wouldn't appoint a Catholic girl, as teacher. Yeah, or discriminate against a Catholic girl. And so I remember my mother saying, well, why don't we can vote for the school committee men. And why don't you go out and vote and cast your vote? And why don't you go out and vote for someone who will allow, won't be discriminating against the Catholics. So I got interested in it.
But then you, at the age of 18, you joined the National Women's Party. Why did you pick that organization? There was another organization.
I didn't join the National Women's Party. What happened was that, of course, I knew the women were being arrested in Washington. And I knew that Carrie Chapman Catt in New York was doing a beautiful job. But they weren't, I appreciated the fact that the women who were being arrested were forcing the people in this country to take notice. And so I was in Brown Townsend's in Hartford. And I must have attended some of their meetings. Oh, I remember. I used to remember Catherine Hepburn outside the Strand Theater. And she used to give out posters, you know. And I used to see them. And so I was in Brown Townsend. And Mrs. Hepburn came along. And she knew, I used to help them give out posters, too. Now that I think that how she knew me. And she says, they used to call me Little Purtell. And she said, Little Purtell, could you go to Washington? And, you know, and be arrested and demonstrate. And I said, well, Mrs. Hepburn, I haven't got any money to go to Washington. I can't afford it. But I did have a week's vacation coming from the travel. But I said, I've got a week's vacation, but I can't afford to go. She said, will you go if I pay your way? I said, I certainly will. So that's how I went.
And you went down on the train? Were there a number of other women who went with you?
No.
Were there many other young working women who were involved in the suffrage movement with you?
Well, you see, the working women had to look out for their jobs. And that's what I once said to Alice Paul. There are a lot of women who would be here, working women who would be here, but they can't afford it. You look at that book that I have for you, Mrs. H.O.P. Belmont. It was the women with money who could afford it. And there were an awful lot of working women who would love to have gone, but they couldn't afford it.
Well, you were among the members of the National Women's Party who were among the pickets at the White House in support of the federal movement. You were arrested and jailed in 1918?
1918, that's right, August 1918. I was arrested 4 times.
I know, we would like to hear about the story of your arrest.
The reason that I was arrested 4 times in one day was that I was so young. And I could climb the statue, and a lot of the women couldn't do that. I could climb the statue.
What were you climbing?
Lafayette, we are here in Lafayette.
And you would climb the statue?
Oh, yes, that's what I was arrested for climbing the statue of Lafayette. And saying, Lafayette, we are here.
So they arrested you once,
and they would take us down to the jail. And then they'd let us go. And the older women, a lot of the women couldn't go back. But I went back 4 times. And I remember that. And I remember I carried the flag, the American flag, and it said, and then I carried another flag, and it said, I come from Connecticut, the cradle of liberty.
But finally.
Okay, I'm going to stop it here, and I'm just going to move it ahead for another just 30-minute clip that as I was listening through the first time, I was just amazed to hear this. So hopefully, I know it's sounding a little garbled to some of you, but hopefully you can pick this up. And this is a comment she's making in the context of her relationship to working with African Americans and working with the NAACP. Let me just get a little bit further along.
Edna M. Purtell,
Oh,
at her
geez.
home in West. Like all of your many political activities, was it difficult to find people who would be willing to work with Black people, or and did Black people ever join with you in promoting?
Oh, I worked with Mrs. Clarence Seymour in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Oh, yes.
So after I'd been talking about these two women separately, I'm listening to this tape, and she said, I worked with Mary Townsend Seymour. So I thought that was amazing. Okay, I'm just going to put my share. Is my screen on now?
Yes, it is
Okay.
loaded. Yes, there it is. Very good.
Okay. I just got to get to my slide. I know that for some of you that was garbled, but hopefully some of you could pick up her story about being arrested and climbing the statue and her pride. I think I cut off a part at the end where she said, all these other women fasted for 5 days, but I fasted for 6 because on the 6th day, I wanted to go get communion, and I knew I had to fast before communion. So, she was very big on, I fasted longer than anyone else. Okay, so I just wanted to add here that Purtell is joined by 26 Connecticut women protesting the Senate delay in voting on the suffrage amendment. The women refused to pay their fines. They were sent to Occoquan Workhouse in Virginia, a prison for women convicted of prostitution and drunkenness. She talks about being arrested by this policeman who actually, she said at the end that her flag stood for liberty, and he snatched the flag away from her and broke 2 of her fingers. But she said some of the police were nice. She said one of the police officers sent her ice cream in prison. She said, not so good when you're on a hunger strike. Purtell claimed to be the youngest woman ever to be arrested, thrown in jail, and go on a hunger strike for suffrage. Their treatment at the prison and the complaints that poured in to President Wilson helped to change his mind about suffrage. Mrs. Markham, head of the anti-suffragists, warned that the arrested suffragists were allied with the Reds and were trying to incite class and race hatred. At the same time, the National Women's Party, led by Alice Paul, thought that to get the amendment passed, they would have to win some southern states. She said they needed a realistic strategy of doing nothing to antagonize southern politicians, and this position was published in the New York World. The strategy was to say that the vote in the South would not include Black women. Seymour picked up the phone in March 1919 and called New York City headquarters of the NAACP to say how disappointed she was in Alice Paul. Seymour knew that the National Women's Party denied African Americans a place in a suffrage parade back in 1913. Seymour then wrote to Mary Ovington telling her she would contact Josephine Bennett because she would never waver on the vote for Black women. Seymour knew that Bennett knew Alice Paul quite well and felt that Bennett could sway her. Seymour's power came from her ability to work across race lines and build coalitions. She knew the importance of the franchise for Black women, especially, and she ably spoke to and worked with white women leaders and working class women on the suffrage issues. When you look at this map, you can see Alice Paul's strategy was somewhat suspect. In fact, there was one state from the South that did ratify the amendment, Tennessee, but there were 3 states in the North that did not, Connecticut, Vermont, and Delaware. Seymour saw through Paul's strategy and used her connections and relationships to address the National Woman's Party. By March 1920, World War I was over, the Treaty of Versailles rejected, the pandemic ended, but women still didn't have the right to vote. For Seymour, who lived in the city of Hartford, where 5 of the top Hartford factories employed no Black men or women, she did not see racial equality and women's suffrage as 2 separate issues. In November 1920, Mary Townsend Seymour became the first African-American woman to run for the Connecticut State Assembly. Suffrage movement had a profound effect on the women who participated, even though they were not capable of moving those who wanted to keep the vote just for men. The suffrage movement in Connecticut was an incubator for organizing, education, and building leaders. Cross-class alliances, women lobbying for multiple issues, and women divided on an issue that today we might think would unite them. When they won the right to vote in August 1920, it must have felt like a huge victory for women like Seymour and Purtell. They were not leaders in the movement, but they knew that suffrage was a key to power in a democracy. They surely would have agreed with Ruth Dodorian, who is here. She was also a Hartford woman who later moved to West Hartford. She was the press secretary for the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association and lifelong member of the League of Women Voters. She said, "What had it all been for? Do you think that those who led in the work could have carried it on with such indomitable spirit only in order that women might go to the polls once a year and drop their ballots in a box? Do you think they could have done it if they had not believed that women could use their votes to wipe out the injustices between man and between woman and man, to lift intolerable burdens from motherhood and childhood? Even if we wanted to, could we possibly escape the responsibility of victory?" This responsibility for these women went beyond the vote. For Emily Pearson, she went back to school at Yale University to get her medical degree and worked as a school doctor and health director in Cromwell until the mid-1950s. She was particularly interested in women's and children's health and traveled to Russia and China and was intrigued by the ideas of socialism. For Purtell, the responsibility for victory included continuing her work on a large number of progressive issues that involved wiping out injustice and lifting the burdens from motherhood and childhood, supporting the Farmer Labor Party as well as the Democrats. She used her strong core values, her speaking ability, and her persistence and stayed in the public sphere. She refused to become part of the League of Women Voters, founded in 1923, because she was a strong believer in partisan politics. She supported the Free Ireland movement. She was deeply involved with the Federated Democratic Women's Club, having leadership roles there. She became a state labor investigator and stayed involved in politics. Seymour continued to work for the NAACP. She ran for office as well. Here you see the group of women who helped to install a plaque in 1934 at the state capitol to remember the suffrage activists. 2 women, Seymour and Purtell, didn't make it to the plaque. This victory meant a lot to them. It was arduous and painstaking in coming, and it invested the women with a concentration, commitment, and an activist spirit stronger than it might have if the battle had come easily. For Seymour and Purtell, after 1920, the relationship built, the skills, the confidence, the ability to organize, to make cross-class alliances, cross racial barriers, and work on issues all helped these 2 who had power to help those without power, to build a stronger community and to win the dignity of all people. Can we add to this plaque, which is in the state capitol, as we learn more about this movement? I think there should be an additional plaque. The vote is powerful, but women didn't turn out to vote in the same number as men until 1980. This year, Jillian Gilchrist, Tammy Exum, and Kate Farrar show us the power of women in elections. These women make up West Hartford's Democratic slate for the General Assembly this year, the first time we could have 3 women in the legislature. Sherry Cantor is the mayor in West Hartford. Deb Poland is the head of the Board of Ed. And you see Minnie Gonzalez, who has a state office, and Aisha Clark, who is the head of the Board of Education in Hartford. 100 years of civic engagement has brought us here. So 100 years ago, we studied the confluence of women's civic engagement, World War I, and the flu epidemic. Today, we see the confluence of COVID-19, the Black Lives Matter movement, and women's political power. Let's hope that this civic engagement and the power of women will right the ship of state in another 2 weeks. And remember that we are standing on the shoulders of those who came before. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tracey. I'm going to now open it up for Q&A. I put a notice in the chat just to let people know when you do exit, please do take the survey. It's very important information for us. And if you have a question, please use the raise your hand function. I'm hoping that's working. And then I'll unmute your microphone.
And Jeff, do you want me to stop sharing?
Yeah, I think that would be good. Go ahead
Okay.
and stop sharing, and then we'll see you better.
Let's see if I can, let's see how I do that. Sharing your screen.
Okay.
Oh, stop sharing. That will do it.
Okay. And do you have your video on?
How I do.
There we go. There we go. Okay.
And can I see the attendees in any way or no?
I don't know if you can, but I'm trying to see if anybody's raised their hands, and I'm not seeing it. So let me ask the audience this: if you have a question, could you just write into the chat, just say I have a question, and open up your microphone. You don't need to put the question in there. Just say,
call on me.
I have a question. Call on me. Okay, Bill Hosley, you are on, sir.
How do I? Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Hey, so Connecticut was the 37th?
Correct.
And does that mean it was lagging behind almost everybody else at the time?
Well, yeah, I mean, 36, they needed 36 to ratify out of 48, and we were 37.
Oh, so the famous thing with Tennessee happened before?
Yes, it happens in August, like August 20th or something like that, maybe August 28th. Yeah, and then we ratify in mid-September because there was some question about the legality of the vote in Tennessee. So
wow.
That's what allowed Holcomb to say it was an emergency.
And what explains being so far behind the curve?
Well, I guess I try to argue it is these. I mean, it's a hard sell, right? You have men. All these men have to vote for women to get the right to vote, and so they see it as giving up power, and they also fear some of these issues like prohibition, and they fear that if women get the right to vote, that prohibition will pass, and there's all these different issues. So
what was that the case also in Massachusetts and New Jersey and New York?
Yes, but it's just interesting because it is a Republican issue, but the Republicans here are really conservative, and so Republicans in other states. I mean, I think one of the motivations for this special session that's called in September is that they realize that that all these women are going to get the chance to vote, and if the Republicans don't vote for it, then they're in trouble. So I have to say I attribute it in a lot of ways to the Republican leadership here, Holcomb and the two senators, and of course there was an inability to pass it on the state level as well.
Very good. Thank you. This has been great.
Thank you. Jeff, I can't hear you. I can see your.
Sorry, I forgot to. I turned myself off.
Yeah.
Okay. is Jerry. I said thank you to Bill, and up next is Jerry, and then Jerry Murphy, and then Don Rogers. Go ahead, Jerry.
Okay. First, Tracey, thank you. This was great. I really enjoyed it. But before I ask my question, just a quick comment. Listening to Bill Hossley, I was reminded that Connecticut of 100 years ago was totally different than the Connecticut of today. I obviously wasn't alive then, but I do remember hearing from my grandparents that around 1920, it was very white, very conservative Republican. And just the fact that, for example, this past Sunday, the Hartford Courant endorsed Joe Biden for president. This is not meant to be a political push, but that is only the fourth time since the 1700s that the Courant has endorsed a Democrat to run for president. And
Wow.
100 years ago, they wouldn't even dreamed of it. The Courant would have always supported whoever was the Republican nominee for president. I have a slightly different question. It goes back to the beginning part of your presentation about voting, because in some respects, at least in Hartford, it appears we've slid backwards a bit. In fact, something that I even covered in one of my classes about a year ago, there was an election for the Board of Education in Hartford. And remember, Hartford's 128,000 people, and there's supposedly over 60,000 registered voters. And only 2,200 people even voted. And the winner received just around 2,000 votes. And that's just a little frustrating. And if you could comment about, how unfortunately it's gone backwards in terms of people actually getting up to vote.
Yeah, that's a tough.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how I answer that, but I think we see voting as, I don't know, in some ways the tip of the iceberg of civic engagement. Though I know in neighborhoods in Hartford there is civic engagement. There are neighborhood organizations that have involved people. But getting people to vote, it seems to be a difficult thing. But I think, sometimes happens like in West Hartford now, this woman, Kate Farrar, is running. There's no Republican running against her. And so it's not a contest. So I think, in some ways in Hartford, it's so democratic. I mean, the opposition sometimes is the Working Families Party, but maybe people are seeing that they don't think there is a choice, or that it's a foregone conclusion because there may not be opposition. But that's just I'm sort of guessing there. But I think it's a real issue. Because I do think that, in a democracy, we need people to vote.
Yep. Okay, well, thank you. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry, for your comment and for your question. We're going to move over to Don Rogers now. Go ahead, Don.
So thank you very much for a very nice presentation.
Thank you.
Good. I have two related questions. It struck me that Seymour ran on the farm labor ticket rather than on the ticket of the Democrats or the Republicans. And that raises in my mind how strange were the women suffragists from not only the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party.
Hello, everyone. How are you tonight? Welcome to our event. I'm Natalie Belanger. I'm the adult program.
Natalie has joined us.
So my question is, how strange were suffragists both before and after the 19th Amendment from the Republican and Democratic parties? They didn't seem to sort of work their way into either party very quickly. And the related question is, this is a time when the Connecticut Assembly was very malapportioned. The House of Representatives was elected by town rather than population, which would sway the political system more toward the Republicans. And I'm wondering if that's a factor in explaining why suffrage was so difficult to get through in Connecticut.
Yeah, let's see, for the first one, I said that there were, I think, 24 women who ran. Maybe I said 28, and 5 women won. All of them were Republicans. All the women who won were Republicans in that first round in 1920. And the first senator was in 1928. She was a Republican as well. There's a woman in West Hartford, Louise Duffy, who we have a school named after here, who ran in 1924 as a Democrat. And if you read the articles in the newspaper, it's sort of like, who, how does she think she could ever win running as a Democrat in West Hartford? And so the Republicans, the women who won early on in the 20s were all Republicans. And so I do think, it was difficult for women to break into to the party structure. And so what happened was there was a parallel structure that grew up. They were called, I think I mentioned it for Purtell, the Federated Democratic Women's Party. And so Louise Duffy at one point was the vice president of that. And Edna Purtell was in the leadership of this women's arm of the Democratic Party. And so they're very involved in electoral politics, but as mostly helping men get elected. And then those two groups come together. I think it's not until maybe the late 1960s when the women's and the men's part of the Democratic and Republican parties come together. And then there's a big role that women play in the League of Women Voters, which grows out of the suffrage movement. The League of Women Voters is bipartisan, or nonpartisan, I guess I should say. And they saw their job as building educated voters. And Purtell would not be a part of that because she felt like partisan politics was where things happened. But I think they play an important role in building the power of women's votes. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Dawn, for that question. I think that wraps up the questions, Tracey. That was a fabulous talk. If we were in an actual auditorium, we would hear a whole bunch of clapping right now. Sorry, I don't have. But in any case, I just want to thank you for joining us tonight and to sharing all of this with us. I want to thank all of you who joined us tonight, and thank you for many of you who've been coming back each week. I see some people writing clap, clap, clap. Wonderful presentation. Thank you, Robert. So in any case, I just wanted to thank Bill Hosley again for the work that he's put into making this series happen. Thank Connecticut Humanities, thanking Capital Community College, Mike Bees, our technical director, who has worked so hard to get these things to work. And as you exit, please do fill out the survey. And we do want to invite you to come back and re-listen to lectures or listen to ones you didn't hear and share them with others. It's at the Capital Community College website. And I will just put that up there one more time before we go. It's the Hartford Heritage Project website from Capital Community College. You'll see all the recordings there. So good night, everyone. Good night, Tracey.
Thank you so much for the chance to do this. I really appreciate it.
Great. Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye.